We all knew the movie was going to be bad, let's be real. Yet, aside from the garbage fire that is going to be the movie, you talk to any modern Broadway kid or anybody who's a fan of Broadway in general, and they know what this is. People cannot stop talking about this musical, especially when it came out, and when you really look at its substance, it's extremely problematic. First of all, I really want to commend Justin Paul and Ben Pasek for really capturing a story that isn't really handled super well. Like when you look at all modern portrayals of mental illness, and not even modern, but just like throughout our media, mental illness is something that is usually associated with stigma and unfortunately isn't handled with the kind of depth that Hollywood needs to because it's Hollywood. They're completely devoid of emotion. They don't know what it's like to talk about real issues. But I think that Dear Evan Hansen, the musical, not this movie, really offers a unique perspective into the mind of someone who just feels so lost and broken. They just let their inner turmoil manifest and ends up accidentally exploiting another person's emotional turmoil, really multiple people's emotional turmoil, because when you really look at what Evan does, whether it's by quote unquote accident or not, he manipulates an entire family into believing that their dead son was friends with him, basically so that he can feel a sense of belonging in the world. And the writers of the original musical claimed that this idea came from one of the writers dealing with somebody who took their own life when they were in high school. I know from personal experience, in my high school, we unfortunately had a very popular kid pass away due to an accident. And yeah, I witnessed a lot of people that were not close with this kid at all. And I wasn't either, but I knew these people weren't either. I just witnessed them basically talking about how much they miss him and how good of a friend he was, even though they didn't even have a close relationship with them. And I think that a lot of people sympathize with Evan and sympathize with people like that because when something like this happens, when somebody so young dies, whether it's on accident or I feel like especially when it's their own life, when you really are able to look at the catastrophic events that transpire from someone feeling, the effects of mental illness, it's really difficult, especially for teenagers, because according to adults, teenagers have no emotions and don't feel shit. But that's not true. Like, we go through a lot, especially during the pandemic. The problem with Dear Evan Hansen is that it basically outlines a story that forces you to relate with the main character, when in reality, the main character would not be someone you would sympathize with at all. With any musical, you need to have your establishing numbers before you get into the main conflict of the movie to kind of set up your main characters. So, looking at the first couple of songs on the soundtrack, we have our introductory Mom song, we have Anybody Have a Map, we have Waving Through a Window, and then we have For Forever, which For Forever is a loaded song to jump into, especially only being the third song on the soundtrack. And I actually think what the writers do and the composers do is actually subtly a very contorted form of genius because right after For Forever and you realize that this kid basically transformed his story of his solitary suicide attempt to a fun day between friends, one of which who is now dead. And then following that, they have Sincerely Me, which is a very fun song. Like, I sing to it and dance to it all the time, but it's so bleak and almost insulting. It's presented as a fun little ditty and maybe even a bonding moment between Jared and Evan, which, by the way, I think this movie version of Jared is going to be a little nicer. Musical Jared is a dick, and I absolutely love Will Rowland's performance and how he kind of portrays the friend who's not a friend, the family friend, perfectly, like the kind of kid who's only forced to hang out with you, but like all the meanwhile he has his own insecurities, and that's why he like brags about his non-existent sex life and over-exaggerates everything in his life, something that Evan is too scared to do. But I think that in this number, Evan really learns from Jared. He's kind of able to see how to lie and how to manipulate people, however heinous it may be, for his own benefit. And that's something that the only person who has shown him attention in, we can assume, the last couple years. He's been exposed to that constantly. And I think that the whole marketing campaign of the movie showing that this is kind of like for the outsider in all of us, like, sure, Evan's an outsider and he deals with some really serious stuff, but the way he handles it is just so out of touch with the overall narrative of like being found and learning to love yourself and having people accept you for who you are. This part of Evan that lies and manipulates for his own benefit is an intrinsic part of him. And I think that that's something that the audience often forgets while watching the show. We all know that one moment, I think, before Disappear, it's been a while since I've seen the show, where Ghost Connor kind of enters the mix and he serves as Evan's inner monologue that helps him deal with the shit show he's gotten himself into. And Connor says the famous line, and when Evan describes him going to the park and climbing the tree, and he says, "Did you fall or did you let go?" Now, personally, that line is hauntingly beautiful. It's something that I think a lot of people, myself included, with mental illness can really relate to, like anybody who's struggled with suicide and with thinking that you don't matter. So I think that after this quote and then dealing with Disappear, and again, I'm not 100% sure if it's before Disappear. I just re-listened to the soundtrack on the train when I was coming back to the city, but I think it's either before Disappear or before You Will Be Found. I'm 90% sure it's before Disappear. Correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. But then by having Disappear and subsequently You Will Be Found, Evan is automatically excused for his actions because, like, we need an uplifting number to show all of the kids we're preaching to that you matter. And it's a beautiful message, but I don't think it's handled very well. I think those two songs being back to back with each other was probably the best choice with the pacing of the songs, because before that we kind of have a very wonky pacing of the songs. And I just want to say that I do enjoy the songs in the musical. Like I said, I have a fun time with Sincerely Me. I think that there's a lot of emotional weight to the songs, but just in the context of the story, it's all the less more impactful because you're basically trying to sympathize with a pathological liar with an anxiety disorder. And just because he struggles with anxiety and depression does not mean he's any less of a bad person. I think an underlying theme in Dear Evan Hansen that a lot of people forget about because, you know, you have You Will Be Found and You Matter on like every poster. I think it's really drives home the theme of hurt people hurt people. Like when you really look at every single character in the show besides Evan and Connor, they're all hurting. And I think that's one of the show's strengths. Like it opens up with not even the main characters talking about their struggles. Their parents are talking about their struggles, and I think it's a really interesting perspective that it shows what parents of children with mental illnesses are dealing with, because it's a lot on parents. When you see somebody you love hurting, it hurts you too. And I think that the show handles that really well, especially with other teenage characters like Alana and with Zoe, and really more with Zoe's lack of hurting when her brother does commit suicide. And I think that is an interesting thing about how someone who's so close to the victim, unlike Evan, who wasn't close at all, but you're trying to show that he was, Zoe was literally Connor's sister, and she, in Requiem, could not care less about the reactions of the people around her. Like, in the beginning of the show, when Evan first has dinner with her family, he is kind of outcasted by her. She almost is like, yeah, you're full of shit. But it's through his nervous demeanor and then the hot flaming garbage that is If I Could Tell Her, that he's able to work her into his web of lies. And it's so interesting how we view vulnerable people and victimized people, and how we kind of assume that somebody who's been diminished to a fragile emotional state can't hurt you because they're already hurting so much themselves. And I think that that really ties in with one of the themes that people often overlook, which is hurt people hurt people. And that's really what Evan is. He's a boy hurting, and I don't think he necessarily means to hurt the Murphys or anyone else around him, but I want people to stop assuming that Evan is just along for the ride. He is the character, the main character in this story. He has full control over his actions. Words Fail could have come way sooner in the soundtrack, and I understand that it had to be towards the end and that everything was kind of gonna go to hell after that number. That's why I'm really upset at the movie that they're changing the ending to make him even more of a redemption character. Like, we should not be sympathizing with this kid. Other than the fact that he is suicidal, that is where the sympathy should stop. Like, we should hear his line from Connor about, did you fall or did you let go? And that's where the sympathy should reach its peak. Not after Words Fail. And even in So Big, So Small, that's painted as a bonding moment between him and his mom, and that song personally makes me cry. I don't know why, because, like, my parents aren't even divorced, but I feel sympathy for Evan's mom more than anybody. I do think it's important to mention, however, that I don't think, except for If I Could Tell Her, because that was just a really big mistake on the writer's part, that song never should have been made or written. I think that every single song on this soundtrack is not put in there by accident. To Break in a Glove is often seen as, oh, it's the dad bonding song. But it really represents how certain characters are dealing with the tragedy that surrounds him. Like, the dad is also kind of indifferent, not to the point where he's using really hostile language, like Zoe when she calls Connor a monster. He's just kind of discontent, you know? He's like, oh, I bought this glove for some birthday, Christmas, I don't know. I think that the dad's tone really conveys a sense of hopelessness, like that he wasn't even able to pick up on something. And I think that, I hope that the movie touches on this, even though, again, the movie is going to be terrible, and I recognize that. I hope that they don't take out Connor's drug use, because I think that drug use often has a lot of connotations with mental illness, and that kids use drugs as a way of numbing themselves or as a way of coping. And I think that a lot of them just was like, oh yeah, he's a pothead, and like they didn't really even question why he smoked a lot of weed all the time. Like, it maybe couldn't have been because he was feeling really lonely or isolated from the people around him. But I guess when you come from a privileged family who values keeping up appearances, I guess that they wouldn't be super sensitive to that. But I don't know, there's just so many elements of this story that is wrong, and it just outweighs the good. I'm sorry, like, when I think about this musical and when I listen to the soundtrack, there are certain songs that really hit home, but then there's other songs that I'm just like, this story is basically about how a sad kid accidentally becomes kind of a sociopath, and I just know that any sense of compelling emotion or action that the musical had, even from being on such a small set with a limited cast, the movie's going to destroy that by trying to make it something that it's not. And again, by changing the ending and giving Evan more of a redemption arc story, I think that completely defeats the purpose of that we are not supposed to entirely sympathize with his character. I think that the movie could have capitalized on that more and kind of made Evan a worse character than he was in the musical, and I think that that would be more meaningful. But instead, they're going to dial it down a little bit more, get that sweet Hollywood moolah, exploit the theater kids, and then we're all going to go back to waiting for the Wicked movie. So, what do you guys think about Dear Evan Hansen? Do you like it? Do you hate it? Are you somewhere in between? Let me know in the comments below, and thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys next time. Is that my Zoe Murphy inspired outfit?